The decline of Buddhism in India, the land of its birth, occurred for a variety of reasons and happened even as it continued to flourish beyond the frontiers of India. Buddhism had seen a steady growth from its beginnings in the 6th century BCE to its endorsement as state religion of the Maurya Empire under Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. It continued to flourish during the final centuries BC and the first centuries of the Common Era, and spread even beyond the Indian subcontinent to Central Asia and beyond to China. But a steady decline of Buddhism in India set in during the later Gupta era and under the Pala Empire. Chinese monks traveling through the region between the 5th and 8th centuries CE, such as Faxian, Shanzang, Yijing, Huasheng, and Song Yun, began to speak of a decline of the Buddhist Sangha, especially in the wake of the White Hun invasion. Decline continued after the fall of the Pala dynasty in the 12th century CE and the gradual Muslim conquest in the Indian subcontinent. By that time, Buddhism had become especially vulnerable to hostile rulers because it lacked strong roots in society, as most of its adherents were ascetic communities. Apart from a small community in eastern Bengal in which it had survived from ancient times and Nepal, Buddhism was virtually extinct in India by the end of the 19th century. In recent times, Buddhism has seen a revival in India due to the influence of Anagarika Dharmapala, Kripasaran Mahastava, R. Ambedkar and Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama. Early hardships. The Buddha's period saw not only urbanization, but also the beginnings of centralized states. The successful expansion of Buddhism depended on the growing economy of the time, together with increased centralized political organization capable of change. During the Maurya Empire, during which Ashoka banned Vedic sacrifices as contrary to Buddhist benevolence, Buddhism began its spread outside of its Magadha homeland. The succeeding Shungas reinstated the sacrifices. They also built the large Sanchi stupa next to Ashanga capital. The overall trend of Buddhism's spread across India and state support by various regional regimes continued. The consolidation of monastic organization made Buddhism the center of religious and intellectual life in India. Pushyamitra, the first ruler of the Shunga dynasty, built great Buddhist topes at Sanchi in 188 BCE. The succeeding Kamva dynasty had 4 Buddhist Kamva kings. Pushyamitra Shunga has been recorded as being hostile to Buddhism, burning sutras, Buddhist shrines and endorsing the massacre of monks. Although such issues remains disputed, Belgian historian and Hindu scholar Koenraad Elst writes, the story is in fact given in 2 near-contemporaneous Buddhist histories, the Asokavadana and the Divyavadana. The 2 narratives are almost verbatim the same and very obviously have a common origin. This non-contemporary story about Pushyamitra's offering money for the heads of Buddhist monks is rendered improbable by external evidence. The well-attested historical fact that he allowed and patronized the construction of monasteries and Buddhist universities in his domains, as well as the still extant stupa of Sanchi, 6 after Ashoka's lavish sponsorship of Buddhism. It is perfectly possible that Buddhist institutions fell on slightly harder times under the Shungas, but persecution is quite another matter. Buddhist historian Etienne Lamotte has observed, to judge from the documents, Pushyamitra must be acquitted through lack of proof. The gradual expansion in the scope and authority of caste regulations shifted political and economic power to the local arena, reversing the trend of centralization. The caste system gradually expanded into secular life as a regulative code of social and economic transactions. In ancient times, the 4 Varnas were primarily a categorization scheme and the Vedas did contain prohibitions regarding intermarriage. There were, however, large numbers of jatis, probably originally tribal lineage groups. According to many scholars, the Shunga kings were seen as more amenable to Buddhism and as having contributed to the building of the stupa at Bharat, and an inscription at Bodh Gaya at the Mahalbodhi temple records the construction of the temple as follows. the gift of Nagadevi, the wife of King Brahmamitra. Another inscription reads, the gift of Kurangi, the mother of living sons and the wife of King Indranamitra, son of Kosiki. The gift also of streamer of the royal palace shrine. Theories of decline due to Indian influences. The period between the 400 BC and 1000 CE saw a shift of royal patronage from Buddhist to Hindu institutions. Brahmanism gained influence at the expense of Buddhism. Although the influence of Buddhism on Brahmanical ideology was an important factor for the growth of Brahmanism, traditional Brahmanism is said by some writers to have competed in political and spiritual realm with Buddhism in the Gangetic Plains, while Buddhism flourished in the realms of the Bactrian kings. Historians have suggested several possible reasons for the decline of Buddhism, with the fading out of Buddhism from the landscape of India and the rise of Shaivism and Vaishnavism. Brahmanical philosophers like Adi Shankara, along with Madhvacharya and Ramanuja, gained a prominent position in the revived Brahmanical philosophy. Guptist Buddhism saw a brief revival under the Guptas. By the 4th to 5th century, Buddhism was already in decline in northern India, even as it was achieving spreading into Central Asia and along the Silk Road as far as China. It continued to prosper in Gandhara under the Shahi kingdom, who encouraged Buddhist religious ambassadors into Asia. Half of the population of the Gupta dynasty supported Buddhism and the 5 precepts were widely observed. The Hindu rulers and wealthy laity gave lavish material support to Buddhist monasteries. Collapse of Empire of Harsha in the north and west. The collapse of Empire of Harsha gave rise to many smaller kingdoms, leading to the rise of the martial Rajputs clans across the Gangetic Plains. It also marked the end of Buddhist ruling clans, along with a sharp decline in royal patronage until a revival occurred under the Pala Empire in the Bengal region. Much of what we know about the state of Buddhism during Harsha's reign comes from the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who traveled widely and documented his journey. Although he found many regions where Buddhism was still flourishing, he also found many where it had sharply and startlingly declined, giving way to Jainism and a Brahmanical order. Xuanzang compliments the patronage of Harshavardhana. He reported that Buddhism was popular in Kanyakubja, modern-day Uttar Pradesh, where he noted an equal number of Buddhists and heretics, and the presence of 100 monasteries and 10,000 bhikshus along with 200 Deva, or Hindu, temples. He found a similarly flourishing population in Udra, modern Odisha, a mixed population in Kosala, homeland of Nagarjuna, and in Andhra and Dravida, which today roughly correspond to the modern-day Indian states of Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. In a region he calls Kanganapura, which may be Kolhapur in southern Maharashtra, he found great numbers of Buddhists coexisting with a similar number of non-Buddhists, and a similar situation in northern Maharashtra. In Sindh he finds a large Samitiya and Theravada population. He reports a fair number of Buddhists in what is now the rest of Pakistan. In Dharnyakatakar, today's Vijayawada, he found a striking decline, with Jainism and Shaivism being more popular. In Bihar, the site of a number of important landmarks, he also found a striking decline and relatively few followers, with Hinduism and Jainism predominating. He also found relatively few Buddhists in Bengal, Kamarupa, or modern Assam, no Buddhist presence in Konyoda, few in Chulia or Tamil region, and few in Gujarat and Rajasthan, except in Vallabha where he found a large Theravada population. During the reign of the Chalukya dynasty, Xuanzang reported that numerous Buddhist stupas in regions previously ruled by the Buddhist sympathetic Andhras and Pallavas were ruined and deserted. These regions came under the control of the Vaishnavite Eastern Chalukyas, who were not favorable to Buddhism and did not support the religion. Xuanzang's report also mentions that in the 7th century, Shashanka of the Kingdom of Gauda was expanding his influence in the region in the aftermath of the fall of the Gupta Empire. He is blamed by Shanzang and other Buddhist sources for the murder of Rajavardhana, a Buddhist king of Thanissar. Shanzang writes that Shashanka destroyed the Bodhi tree of enlightenment at Bodh Gaya and replaced Buddha statues with Shiva lingams. However, it has been claimed by Ramesh Chandra Majumdar that Shanzang had a Buddhist bias in favor of the Buddhist rulers such as Harshavardhana, and that his account may therefore be slanted. However, Majumdar's thesis is disputed, and has been claimed by Varada to be part of a pattern of attempted acquittals of any Buddhist persecution by Brahmanical parties. Buddhism in southern India. In the south of India, there was no overt persecution of Buddhists. Bodhidharma, a patriarch of Zen Buddhism, was of the original Kshatriya caste, and Nagarjuna, a philosopher important to Mahayana Buddhism, was a Brahmin from southern India. The Satavahanas were worshippers of Buddha as well as other Hindu gods, and under their reign Amaravati. The historian Durga Prasad notices that Buddha was worshipped as a form of Vishnu. However, Hinduism and Jainism gradually replaced Buddhism as the preferred dunnys of the economic and political elite in the mid-first millennium CE, in south and western India. Furthermore, closing of ranks between Jainism and Vedic Hinduism, and a vigorous revival of Saivite and Vaishnavite Hinduism led to a sharp decline of Buddhism in the region. Gradually, Hindus and Jains occupied sites abandoned by the Buddhist Sangha. Nonetheless, it appears that Buddhism endured longer in southern India than anywhere else in India, with a greatly diminished Sangha still extant as late as 1500. Palace in the east. Under the palace in Bengal, Mahayana Buddhism flourished and spread to Bhutan and Sikkim. The palace created many temples and a distinctive school of Buddhist art. Mahayana Buddhism flourished under the palace between the 8th and the 12th century, before it collapsed at the hands of the attacking Sena dynasty. However, some scholars believe that they were also Shaivite, judging by the image of Shiva and his ox on the coins and the etymology of their names. They had also dedicated shrines to Vishnu. Figures of Vishnu were substantial in number in the Pala era. In addition to figures of Buddha, Vishnu, and Shiva, there were also those of Sarasvati. The Bhakti movement in Bengal, their influence, caste attitudes towards Buddhists, previous familiarity with converting Buddhists, a lack of Buddhist political power, Hinduism's resurgence through movements such as the Advaita and the Bhakti movement, all contributed to a significant realignment of beliefs that relegated Buddhism in India to the peripheries. Philosophical convergence. One factor that contributed to the demise of Buddhism was the diminishing of Buddhism's distinctiveness with respect to the rise of Hinduism. Though Mahayana writers were quite critical of Hinduism, the devotional cults of Mahayana Buddhism and Hinduism likely seemed quite similar to laity, and the developing tantrism of both religions were also similar. Furthermore, Hinduism borrowed elements from Buddhism. Vaishnavites eventually frowned on animal sacrifices and practiced vegetarianism, while Shaivites came to downgrade caste distinctions as not relevant to religious practice. Furthermore, the prominent 8th century CE Hindu philosopher Shankara developed a monastic order on the Buddhist model, and also borrowed concepts from Buddhist philosophy. The relationship of Ankara to Buddhism has been the subject of considerable debate since ancient times. He has been hailed as the arch-critic of Buddhism and the principal architect of its downfall in India. At the same time, he has been described as a Buddhist in disguise. Both these opinions have been expressed by ancient as well as modern authors, scholars, philosophers, historians and sectaries. While Shankara is given credit for the defeat of Buddhism in Hindu literature, he was in fact active after Buddhism had faded from prominence in some areas. When Shankara came north to the intellectual centers there, he borrowed many of the ideas that had been formulated by Buddhist philosophers of the past. Literary evidences point towards an absorption of Buddhist elements by Hindu culture over a period of centuries. Anti-Buddhist propaganda was also reaching its peak during the 8th century when Shankara modeled his monastic order after the Buddhist Sangha. An upsurge of Hinduism had taken place in North India by the early 11th century, as illustrated by the influential Sanskrit drama Prabodhicandrodaya. In the Chandela court, a devotion to Vishnu and an allegory to the defeat of Buddhism and Jainism. The population of North India had become predominantly Shaiva, Vaishnava or Shakta. By the 12th century, a late population of Buddhists hardly existed outside the monastic institutions, and when it did penetrate the Indian peasant population, it was hardly discernible as a distinct community. Buddhist monasteries were well funded and life within was relatively easy.